This is Scott Spears, and today I'm joined by a man with ties to Marion, Ohio that you might not know about. Along the way, he served as Chief White House Counsel to President Richard Nixon, got tied up in a little event called Watergate, became a prolific author, and is here today to discuss the 2012 presidential election. It gives me great pleasure to be joined by John Dean. John, how are you?
I'm wonderful. Nice talking with you, Scott.
John, before we get into the election here, I want you to discuss your ties to Marion, Ohio, which maybe most people don't realize.
Well, I spent, I guess about 4 or 5 years in Marion. I went to junior high school there and did not go to high school. When it came time to go to Harding, which had just been completed when actually I lived right around the corner from the school and watched it being built and used the tennis courts that used to be or maybe still are at the side of the school. So I had a lot of friends and played a lot of golf while I was there and learned to swim at the Y.
Now, is that where your interest in Warren G. Harding came from?
It is. I, as you know, have done a biography for Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and his series on the American presidents on Warren Harding. I'd known Schlesinger for years, and when he started the series, I was talking to him, and I said, obviously I shouldn't go near Nixon, but I said, what are you going to do with Harding? He said, I don't have a clue. I said, well, Arthur, I don't think you've ever given Warren Harding a very fair shake, and that's because I had grown up reading about Harding. Our next-door neighbor was Jack Maxwell, who was the editor of the Marion Star. And Jack gave me my first book on Harding, which I, at about 12, 13, read and greatly enjoyed. So, in a sense, Harding was my first president.
It's a great story, and of course, years later, you wrote the great book, Warren G. Harding, and dedicated it to my favorite radio personality here in Marion, the late Madge Guthrie.
Indeed, I did.
Absolutely.
Dan Guthrie, who was Madge's stepson, and I were very close as kids. My father and his father were best of friends. The Guthrie family was all over the Marion at that time. Dan's family had split, and so he and I would spend time together. And really, right up to the time of his death, we stayed close.
It's a great story, and I don't think most people know that, and I'm glad every time we can talk about that. And when's the last time you were in Marion?
That's a good question. I can recall we came back for a birthday of Madge's, and I was with my mother, and Dan had a bus that he took everybody in the bus down to a restaurant in Columbus, which was the sort of thing Dan would do. He was very fond of Madge, his stepmother, and treated her right all the way. And that I can't remember what year that was. I've tried to put a date on it. It was probably a good 15 or so years ago.
Well, you've got to come back sometime.
Well, I get messages from people who drive by where we used to live and give reports that the house is still standing and in good shape.
What was the address?
That's a good question. I can't tell you the number. It was Brightwood, I believe.
Brightwood. Like I say, it's a tremendous story.
Do you know the number?
I don't know the number. I was going to go drive by there.
Well, it's just before you get to the high school. If you go down Brightwood, which at the time I lived there, it dead-ended into a woods. I'm sure that woods all got developed later, and there was a big woods beside the high school. And you'd take a right and you'd go down and you'd be right at the high school. So it's a block and a half from the high school. So that would put you there.
We'll have to figure it out. If I figure it out, I'll let you know.
Okay.
John, here we are, election time. We're just a few short days away. What's your take? 2012 presidential election.
Well, I think Ohio is an awfully important place in this election. I think that Ohio has long been the maker and breaker of presidents. In fact, I have a friend who you've interviewed, Jim Robinault, who's trying to put together a presidential center to recognize the Ohio presidents. Their properties are kind of spread around, and he's always thought, modern presidents have great libraries built for them. Why not do that for Ohio libraries? I think it's a great idea. But anyway, Ohio, I think, is very important. It's a swing state. I think it will, one way or the other, determine the outcome of this election.
When this all started getting hot and heavy at the end of summer with the conventions, Obama was way up. Then the first debate happened. He went down quite a bit. We've kind of leveled out now, and here we are just hours, days away from the election. What has this whole election meant to you, the Romney-Obama matchup?
Well, frankly, I'm unaffiliated and have been for a long, long time. I'm in California. We have a slot you can sign on the ballot where you're either a Republican or Democrat or declare unaffiliated. In other words, I can vote by registering in either primary, which I don't. But California is fairly blue, and particularly statewide. There are a few spots in Orange County and what have you that are Republican, but otherwise the state is basically heavily Democratic. But anyway, I have voted for both Republicans and Democrats since my days in being active in government and politics, and I am really clearly an Obama supporter. I think he's got the makings of a great president, and I'm extremely disappointed with the overtone of racism that's slipped into this election. It's most unfortunate.
Now, explain that to me, John, because I've read some of the things on that you've wrote and said. What is that for people who don't get it?
Well, here we've got the first African American in the White House, and there has been as conscientious an effort as I've ever seen by Republicans and conservatives to suppress voting. This is a classic way to deal with black voters, in fact, all minority voters, which tend to be Democratic. And the demographics today don't favor the Republican Party, the way their policies or their positions. They solidly favor future growth for the Democratic Party. So it appears to me that there has been not in Ohio alone, but all over the country, a very concerted effort by Republicans and those who support Republican thinking to suppress voting. Well, that isn't a way to win the hearts and minds by using some sort of modernized version of Jim Crow to keep minorities, and particularly African Americans, from voting. I think it's most unfortunate, and I think it's a very sad commentary. I'm shocked at the Ohio Secretary of State and the extent to which he's gone to suppress voting, to make it as difficult as possible. It's really just quite remarkable at this late date to be going through all these things.
John, let me ask you this question, put it this way. If the president on the Democratic side, say it was Bill Clinton in 2012, it was a white male, would this be happening?
I doubt it. It didn't happen back then. What's happened since Clinton was in office also, we've even become more polarized. It starts during Clinton. That's when Newt Gingrich decides to take on the president and lose. and the divisions that started then and the obstructionism that started by Republicans as a matter of how to govern are really rather alarming to me.
John, there's a lot of talk of President Obama's first 4 years, and certainly by the Mitt Romney campaign and most Republican organizations, that it's been a failure. You say that he could be a great president. Tell me why.
Well, I think I don't think there's anybody who, and this isn't to cast blame on Republicans in this instance, but it's certainly their policies that left Obama with monumental problems. The Bush presidency, which was stunningly unsuccessful and took a tremendous surplus that existed when they came in, squandered it in tax breaks and unfunded expenditures and 2 wars, and left a huge deficit. And the economy, and they didn't watch the SEC, took its eyes off of Wall Street and let them put some of the weakest derivative securities imaginable out there that floated mortgages from people who really shouldn't have been given mortgages as a safe, secure investment in massive numbers, and created this deficit and hole in the economy that Obama has been forced to try to dig his way out of. And now Romney is coming in, and people don't recognize he's offering the same policies that Bush had. And my Republican friends really don't want to discuss these things.
What happens if Romney wins on Tuesday?
What happens if he wins? I would be shocked if he won, for one thing, and I think the country's in a whole lot of trouble if that happens.
So you feel it's likely that Obama will win?
Well, if I were a betting man, I would bet on that. Yes.
Do you think?
I think it'd be a travesty should he not. I think it would be a combination of racism and stupidity that would result in him losing.
John, that's a heavy statement, because I can hear the Republicans saying right now, why is it stupidity? Why does it have to be about race? Why would him losing be that?
Well, if I think that will probably be documented by the time it's all over, if that should happen. I don't expect that would happen. But again, the voter suppression that I've referred to is clearly a racist undertaking. It's predominant in the South, but it is seeped out into other states as a matter of policy, of Republican canon and their belief of what they should be doing. It's the only way they feel, I guess, that they can remain as a party is to remain as a white party. And it's stupid because it's not the best thing for the country at this time. Now, I'm one who does not work on ideology. My problem is I'm highly rational about these things. My beliefs, many of them are very Republican-oriented. I, in many ways, consider myself a Goldwater conservative. But today, Barry Goldwater is far to the left of the Republican Party.
We've talked about what would happen if Romney would win. What happens if Obama wins and gets 4 more years?
I think he will continue to pull the country out of the mess that he found it in, and I think 4 years from now he will have created the 12 million jobs that Romney claims that he will create. The reason that Romney won't create those is that he's likely to abandon Obama's policies, which are now taking us to a slow but steady recovery. And you've got to understand also, presidents don't have the kind of magic wands that voters think they have. There's just no president that I can imagine who would ever do anything to try to make the country remain unemployed. And if somebody had a brighter idea, it's difficult to believe that a president would not. I can't imagine a president not accepting it. What Obama's been confronted with virtually from day one is obstructionism. Now, everybody said, well, he had the majority of the Congress. That just isn't true, nor did he have the supermajority needed to control Washington. So he couldn't do anything, and he was blocked at every effort all the way along, even when the Democrats controlled both houses.
Obamacare, good or bad thing?
Well, I think it's probably a good thing. I will say the Republicans have been very successful in demonizing it, and most of the people, when you take and break Obamacare down policy by policy, they say, well, I'm really for that. I really don't want to see that go away. And that's what happens. They'll take something like the mandate and say, well, we've got to get rid of that. Well, you realize when you take the mandate away that you have problems in funding because you have uncovered people, and you need to have more people in the pool to make it worthwhile for the insurance companies to take the trimming they're getting.
Ohio is going to be very important. We talked about it. Romney pretty well has to win Ohio to have a chance to win. Obama doesn't, but it certainly would be a firewall. Where does Ohio go Tuesday?
I would, I have no information other than what I read in the polls and Ohioans I talk to. I traveled Ohio this fall in August. I traveled around visiting with attorneys and talking informally. My sense is that it's going to go for Obama. It'll be close, but I think he may win by 4 or 5%.
Has the leadership during the hurricane meant anything?
I think he'll get a bump out of that. It's hard for me to imagine that there are really many undecided voters at this point. I suppose there are, but, I don't know what rock they're living under that they can go this long and not decide. And those people may well see the president being very presidential and say, well, we don't want to throw the captain off the ship at this point. He's doing a good job. His poll numbers on handling the storm have been wonderful. He's close to 80% approval rate on the way he's handling it.
John, I went to your Twitter page, and just yesterday, October 31st, you put something on there that I found interesting, and I want you to elaborate on this. Mitt makes Nixon look good. He's getting away with his secrecy. What did you mean by that?
Pretty much what I summarized, that Nixon was a notoriously secretive president, and it cost him in the long run his presidency because he was being highly deceptive as well. He got caught in the lie, the likes of which no president had because of Watergate. I've actually, as you know, written several books that deal with that whole issue. And Romney has run a campaign that is more Nixonian than Nixon would try to get away with. He is, for the last 3 weeks, for example, used a very typical Nixon trick, which is don't talk to the press. That's a good way to avoid issues coming up you don't want to confront. That was a standard Nixon policy, is just ignore and stiff-arm the press. He has been very deceptive. Occasionally Nixon would throw things out that they knew intentionally were not correct. Romney has done that, particularly in Ohio again, with the misleading people with his ads about GM and Chrysler and what they're doing in China and what they're doing with Jeep and things like that. Both companies had to come out and say that Romney was wrong, that he was not as I say, Nixon wouldn't push the envelope quite that hard, even.
It's going to be an amazing time Tuesday. Where will you be Tuesday, John?
Actually, I have an eye exam that afternoon. I've already voted. In California, we have a good early voting system and a wonderful absentee ballot system, and I voted a couple weeks ago. So I will be just having a routine day.
Before I let you get out of here, John, I got to do this because this is, if people don't remember, this is the 40th anniversary of Watergate. And there's just a few questions, if you don't mind, I'm dying to ask you about that.
Sure.
For somebody who met Richard Nixon, who was in a room with him, who worked closely with him, there's so much written about him. What was he like? What was the man like?
Different man with different people. Scott, I'm currently in a project that my publishers got me back into Watergate, and I'm working on a book that hopefully I'll have completed before the 40th anniversary of Nixon's resignation. And in taking the project on, I thought most of the important Nixon tapes regarding Watergate had been transcribed. When I tallied it up, I discovered there were something like 400 tapes that either fully or partially had been transcribed. But when I then did something nobody's ever bothered to do, which is catalog all the Watergate conversations, I found that only about a third of the conversations have been transcribed. And so I, for the last 2 years, have had a team of transcribers, graduate students. There's been some turnover in who they are because they've gone on transcribing Nixon conversations. It's a very, very difficult situation. Hard to do. They're hard to hear. Some conversations are excellent. The telephone conversations are good. The EOB office, his executive office, building office, are very hard. The Oval Office is generally good if people are sitting where the microphones were hidden. His Camp David conversations are good. So it's a mixed bag. But anyway, I'm literally following the thread of what did this man know and when did he know it, and I'm learning so much I didn't know. But I'm also listening to Richard Nixon a lot more than I ever had when I was there, and I find he's a different person with different people. He has a wonderful relationship with his wife and his daughters. Now I wasn't surprised about the daughters. I was that the relationship with his wife, Pat, was as close as it was. And these aren't a part of my book, but I picked these things up, and they help color my view of things. Another thing is, I'm surprised to find how little he was told early on about what was really going on. So there'll be some surprises in my recounting this story. We all know the broad outlines of what happened with Watergate. There's a bungled burglary and then a cover-up. The cover-up really wasn't covering up the bungled burglary, but more the fact that these guys, when they had worked at the White House, Hunt and Liddy, had done break-ins for the White House, for John Ehrlichman. Nixon doesn't even know about this. Yet Ehrlichman and Haldeman, the two top aides, are driving the cover-up to protect themselves and not really protecting the president. So your question is, what will people learn, or what would they, if they were in the room with Nixon? It depends upon what circumstances they were in there with. When he's with Colson, one of his top aides, he's as political and dark and black and devious and vengeful as he is with anybody. Same to a degree with Haldeman. In fact, I was listening to a Haldeman conversation today. The anti-Semitism in his conversations with Haldeman are quite remarkable. But then you take somebody like his speechwriter, Ray Price. Well, it's a totally different personality. You take the conversations with me, totally different tone, a whole different level. Aside of Nixon, a lot of this stuff is, people didn't even see the dark side of Nixon. I didn't until it was very late. So he's a very complex character, makes him a very interesting character, but it's not an easy question to answer what one would know. When a guest comes in, they find somebody who's rather shy, not at ease dealing with strangers, who needs a talking paper to talk to them. Just isn't good at small talk.
You know, John, I think it sounds like the book's going to be fascinating, but going through these tapes, you said there's a lot of things you didn't know. Can you give us the hint of an exclusive here? What have you learned? What would be shocking that you found in these tapes that the public would go, oh, wow? I didn't know that.
I'd love to give you a scoop, but I'm not inclined to scoop myself.
I understand that. Not even an inkling at this point, huh?
Not even an inkling.
It's going to be a great book, though.
It will be.
It sounds like it. You know, John, I wanted to ask you this, because you got tied up in this Watergate thing. I know how people portray you in that. How do you portray yourself? What did you do?
Well, I'm not sure I know how people portray me. A lot of different portraits is all I can tell. Those who don't like the fact that I had to stand up and tell the truth have tried to portray me as the mastermind behind the whole thing. They've created out of thin air plots that never even exist. There are no facts to support. Just whole cloth stuff. A lot of conservatives who at one point thought they wanted to like Nixon, but decided that he wasn't one of them, were attacking me for a long time. Other people who realized what was going down and how important it was the truth be told appreciate what I did. It was not a pleasant route I had to travel, but somebody had to do it, and it fell to me. So there are different ways to view this, and I understand that. In writing this book, I'm really surprised at myself at how much detachment I can look at this material with, because I know how the story ends. I have no axe to grind. What I want to do is let the tapes tell the story as it really happened.
Let me ask you this then. Before people knew about the break-in, when it was going on, What did you realize that did you realize something wrong was going on and you weren't saying anything?
Well, I actually tried to leave the White House about a year before Watergate, and the chief of staff, Bob Haldeman, I went in to tell him I wanted to leave, and I was sure my deputy, Fred Fielding, who later would become both Reagan and Bush II's counsel, White House counsel, could handle the job. He said, no, he said, you can't leave. You owe it to us to stay. In essence, he said, if you leave, you'll be a persona non grata here. And really came down hard on me for even wanting to leave. So I'm sure later he wished he'd let me go, but that's another story. But what was your question?
I said, when the original things were going on, before the burglaries...
I did. I was not... I was very young at the time. I went over there. I was 31. And I wasn't sure if this is how it was played in the big leagues. And it was not, I did not like a lot of the things I saw and thought, well, maybe I'm just naive. Well, I now know that is not the way it's played in the big leagues. Nixon was had his own dark side, and it played out in his presidency.
If the burglars don't get caught, does John Dean come forward, knowing that?
Well, there would have been no cover-up if the burglars hadn't been caught.
I guess, would this have been knowledge at some point that this happened?
But what happened?
That they were spying on Democratic headquarters or trying to break in.
Oh, the rest. Well, I don't know that they would have. I don't know if I would have even known it, because nobody, to my knowledge, at the White House really knew what they were doing.
Well, I guess the main...
And I can find no evidence that anybody at the White House knew they were going to break into Watergate. It's not until after it happens that we learn of a lot of the craziness.
Well, it's been reported, and I'm not sure of the accuracy of this, but that you asked Nixon for a formal immunity for the crimes that may have been committed.
Never happened.
That didn't happen.
Never.
And that's on your Wikipedia page.
My Wikipedia? I've never read my Wikipedia page.
It said that you had asked Nixon for formal immunity.
Not true.
And that he had denied you, and that's why you went public.
No, not true.
So that's interesting, because that's on a fairly...
Well, the one time I looked at Wikipedia many years ago, it was so inaccurate that I just said, it'll be interesting to come back to this maybe years from now and take a look, but I just never had occasion to look at it. I'm one who thinks Wikipedia is a great idea, but it doesn't always, particularly with political issues, work out very well, because many of the people who edit Wikipedia have an agenda, and particularly on an issue like this, I've seen them. For example, I have a friend whose father was absolutely just brutalized by editors, and took years to get it cleaned up. Most unfortunate. So Wikipedia is a great concept. It has yet to prove itself to me.
Then let me ask you this, because it's kind of portrayed that the reason you came forward is because Nixon wouldn't give you immunity.
No.
Why did you come forward?
Scott, we're getting into something that I've written books about.
Okay.
So it takes a long time to unwind all that.
Okay, so
but anybody who's curious can read Blind Ambition.
Final question. Did you ever talk to Nixon after you came forward?
Yes, I did.
And
my last conversation with him was many weeks after I had come forward, and I told him I'd come forward. And there were tapes of me talking to him after I had broken rank, and told everybody I was going to break rank.
And his take was, for the rest of his life, do you think he forgave you?
No. Well, it's very interesting. In his memoir, he says, I'm the only one who did try to warn him. He said, why didn't Haldeman? Why didn't Ehrlichman? Dean is the only one who tried to warn me of the problems. So he understood that. But then he didn't think I should have explained everything that was going on. In other words, he would have liked for me to lie.
Well, in a nutshell, saying that, was he a bad guy? Was Nixon a bad guy? Because that's how he's portrayed, I think.
Well, he certainly had a dark streak. He seemed to think that to be an effective leader, you had to be ruthless. I'm not sure that's true. He's a product of the Cold War. His first president was much more ruthless than people know. That's Dwight Eisenhower, who he worked under, whose hidden hand was very effective in dealing with a lot of tough issues during the Cold War. And Eisenhower was no piker when dealing with on the world stage and moving the chess players around as they had to be moved. So he's from an era that people barely understand today, when the threat of nuclear war was very real, and the fact that two countries could mutually destroy each other, and one was hell-bent on taking us over. So it was a tough time, and he's a product of that. And the problem is he didn't adjust as the Cold War receded, and Russia became a much weaker force than believed. And he thought those tactics it's very hard to draw the line between foreign and domestic affairs. And he thought the same tactics that could be used for national security could be employed for domestic problems as well. And that was his downfall.
You know, John, the final question I have for you, and gosh, this is interesting stuff, and I think people should read the books because they are fascinating. It's a fascinating tale. But as you say, certain people remember you certain ways. Obviously, even websites have twisted it a certain way, but you are going to be remembered for that, certainly Watergate and several things you've done after. How would you like to be remembered? Are you glad that you did that? Pulled the trigger against Nixon? Were you guilty? Are you still guilty? How do you see yourself in history's eye?
Well, I don't really think much about that, Scott. I'm going to let history take care of itself, which I think it tends to do. There will always be people who will try to distort it, who have an agenda. But that's one of the interesting things I've noticed, that this truth does tend to bubble its way up and out eventually. That's one of the things that has troubled me deeply about conservatism. They have an alternative universe they live in. They see the world differently than everybody else. They have their own websites. They don't want to read other people's websites that don't think like they do. I'm just the opposite. I read from the right, the left, and the center to try to understand all the points of view. But I'm very worried about those who just want one point of view, and often it's a point of view that's not really soundly based in reality.
Very fascinating. And one final note before we get out of here. We talked a little bit about the upcoming Nixon book that will be out eventually. We talked that there could be a scoop in there, possibly not going to give it today, obviously. But, John, when people read that book, is it going to be a big story? Is there something in there that's going to be a big story?
Well, we'll see. I'm actually still assembling. One of the things I've told my transcribers who are ahead of where I'm listening is to not tell me what they're hearing. I do that for a couple reasons. One, I have to listen to it. I want to listen to I read their transcripts and then listen to the conversations myself. Obviously, when I'm dealing with about just under 1,000 conversations. Some are as short as 5 minutes. Some are as long as 5 or 6 hours. One transcriber just sent me a transcript that runs 60 pages. So some of these are quite long. So it varies. But anyway, I don't know where it's all going to come out at this point. And as I listen to the tapes, I want the material to be fresh to me and to have, in other words, so I can react to it. I have to boil down literally millions of words into a book that'll be maybe 120 to 150 most thousand words, and tell a story. And I've done a similar book called The Rehnquist Choice, where I used the Nixon tapes when they were released that related to his selection of Supreme Court justices, which I was involved in. I didn't know what was happening behind closed doors. I knew what was happening in the rest of the building, but not always some of the conversations, and that helped me complete the story. And there I just had literally 3 dozen tape conversations. So I'm working with a mass of material. It's just a huge project. I've pulled probably 50,000 pages of documents from the National Archives. That's one of the reasons I'm quite sure that while some people will try to distort this history, they really can't. The record is so massive and so complete that they're not going to be able to paint me as something I really wasn't, despite their political motives to do that. So I'm not really terribly concerned about that in the long run. And I'm just going to let the materials sort itself out, Scott, so I can't tell you what it's going to tell. I don't know. I'm not there.
It sounds like it's going to be a fascinating read. And, John, I certainly thank you for taking the time to stop by and talk with us. It's always a fascinating conversation.
Okay. Nice visiting with you, Scott.
Hey, thanks, John. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.